Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 20 December 2024. It is the 122nd anniversary of the birth of Sidney Hook, who was born in New York City on this date in 1902. Hook was a Marxist as a young man, attending Karl Korsch's lectures in Berlin in 1928, and he even did research at the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow in 1929. But Hook gave up his Marxism, and when he gave it up, he really gave it up. He didn't try to straddle the fence. He wasn't an internal critic of Marxism like Ernst Bloch or Leszek Kołakowski, who distanced themselves from orthodox Marxism, but who continued to employ a Marxist framework in their philosophical thought, however unorthodox their Marxism may have been. Hook entirely dissociated himself from Marxism, but he nevertheless retained the influence of Marx. So even though Hook became something of an anti-communist, he continued to think in Marxist terms throughout his life, and this makes him an interesting case. While Hook gave up his overarching Marxist framework for his thought, it's worth observing that Marxist concepts can be used outside the context of Marxism. Generally speaking, we should be more careful in distinguishing the framework within which a given philosopher's thoughts move and the occasional use of a concept borrowed from another framework of thought. Even granted this distinction, Hook's framework is difficult to identify because he used a sufficient number of concepts from Marxism that he is, in a sense, partially still within the framework, although he gave up the ideological commitments of Marxism. And many others followed a similar path. 20th century intellectuals were overwhelmingly influenced by Marxism, but different individuals left the Marxist fold at different times and for different reasons. Bertrand Russell, for example, visited Russia in the 1920s and had his head turned around pretty quickly. So he left early, although it's questionable that we could ever say he was a Marxist in the strict sense. Some left Marxism during Stalin's purges and the show trials during the 1930s. Sidney Hook first broke with communism in 1933, and by the end of the decade, he had fully separated himself from it, so he was in this tranche. Some left with the put down of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, some with the put down of the Prague Spring in 1968, some left with Jaruzelski's crackdown on the Solidarity Labor Union in 1981, some left with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and more left a couple of years later with the collapse of the Soviet Union itself, and some never left the Marxist fold. Many of those who never left didn't leave because they insisted, rightly or wrongly, that the historical record of actual communist regimes shouldn't be the test for Marxist theory. Like the best laid schemes of mice and men, theories often suffer in their implementation. Just as capitalism always falls prey to greed no matter how many safeguards are put into place, communism always falls prey to envy and resentment no matter how many safeguards are put into place, and both systems fall prey to corruption because they are human forms of social organization that are perennially vulnerable to the human, all too human. As Kant once said, no straight thing was ever made from the crooked timber of humanity. Kant had also said that justice be done though the heavens may fall, though he wasn't the first to say this. This was, for example, the motto of the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I, but Hook cited it and attributed it to Kant in his essay Pragmatism and the Tragic Sense of Life from 1960, where he wrote, quote, "The willingness to act on a position like Kant's fiat institia pereat mundus may sometimes, I repeat, sometimes be the best way of preserving a free and just world," unquote. Earlier in the same essay, Hook had said of Kant, quote, "Few are prepared to take the position of Kant in those agonizing moral predicaments that are not uncommon in history, in which the survival of the group can be purchased only at the price of the pain, degradation, and death of the innocent," unquote. So Hook is here placing Kant in the position of the stern moralist who not only sets up a moral code to which human beings are rarely equal, but also a seemingly absolutist doctrine that fails to take into account the complexity of history. This sort of thing didn't get its start with the simplistic ethical emotivism of A.J. Ayer, for example, but it has deep roots in moral philosophy, as we see in Kant. The tragedy of human life for Hook is our being forced into these agonizing moral questions, such as having to sacrifice the innocent to preserve the community, which are often the function of history, which are often the result of history being woven from so many inseparable threads, and each of these threads of very different individual value. I can imagine that someone with the experience of being deep in a given ideological community, as Hook once was within communism, but eventually coming out the other side, would be a person who would be in a particularly good position to appreciate this kind of agonizing moral predicament that are not uncommon in history, as Hook puts it. Ideal theories like Marxism are like this too, more than a little deaf to the realities of history, which force us into compromises we would rather avoid. So Hook's conception of history is something the complexity of which forces us into terrible moral dilemmas, and these dilemmas can't be solved by an absolutist moral doctrine like that of Kant. Hook's appreciation of the complexity of history is evident in his 1943 book, The Hero in History, a study in limitation and possibility. In this, Hook took up the Carlyle-esque theme of the hero in history, which we might think of as a simplistic or even vulgar way to look at history, but in Hook's hands, we find that he doesn't dodge any of the hard problems. On the contrary, one could even say that Hook focuses on the difficult problems that tend to produce the moral agonies he later wrote about. Interestingly, while taking up the problem of the hero in history, Hook does so in Marxist terms. Quote, "Every philosophy of history which recognizes that men can and do make their own history also concerns itself with the conditions under which it is made. It assesses in a broad and general way the relative weight for a certain period of the conditions under which men act and of their ideals, plans, and purposes. These ideals, plans, and purposes are causally rooted in the complex of conditions, but they take their meaning from some proposed reworking of conditions to bring them closer to human desire." Unquote. I assume that in this passage, Hook had continually in his thoughts the famous line from Marx's essay, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte from 1852, which starts out, quote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make their own history just as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living," unquote. And Hook continued on from the previous quote, "The same theme is also involved in the specific inquiries of scientific historians. It is difficult to give a satisfactory account of what happened, how it happened, and why without striking a plausible balance between the part men played and the conditioning scene which provided the materials, sometimes the rules, but never the plots of the dramas of human history. Philosophers have treated this question in the large, historians in the small. The first have offered wholesale solutions, usually in the interest of programs of action or hopes of salvation. The second have eschewed large-scale generalizations and have cautiously gone from case to case. This is preeminently true of the role of the great man or hero in history," unquote. Much of Hook's book, The Hero in History, is an argument against a deterministic reading of history. Hook holds that heroic individuals can materially influence the development of history. Quote, "The existence of possible alternatives of development in a historic situation is the presupposition of significant heroic action. The all-important point for our purposes is whether there are such alternatives of development, their nature and duration. The position taken so far commits us to the belief that there have been and are such alternatives in history with mutually incompatible consequences that might have redetermined the course of events in the past and might redetermine them in the future. Such a view does not controvert the assumptions of scientific determinism, although it controverts the monistic organic determinism we have previously considered. For it does not assert that all alternatives are possible. It recognizes limitations on possibilities, including limitations on the possible effect of heroic action grounded on the acceptance of generalized descriptions or laws of social behavior, unquote. Here, Hook has retained the Marxian conception of human nature as self-made, but only within certain limits. And he used it to formulate a non-Marxian conception of history in which the heroic individual, while working within limitations, can nevertheless shape the historical process. Or perhaps it would be better to say that the heroic individual may shape history, but since this shaping of history takes place within limitations we do not ourselves set or control, the heroic individual may also fail to shape history and could do so through no fault of his own. Coming at the same problem from another angle in his Philosophy and Human Conduct, Hook argues for the influence of ideas on history, which latter is a condition of human beings acting on the belief being able to shape history. Quote, "It requires considerable intellectual sophistication to deny causal influence to ideas in human affairs. For aside from instinctive and habitual conduct, what we do is largely determined by what we believe. Even habitual conduct often presupposes that certain beliefs have been accepted as true in the past. The world we live in is an interpreted world. The evidence for this is so massive that no one but philosophers would doubt it. Ideas are sometimes stronger than the strongest natural impulses. We know that human beings have starved to death in the sight of nourishing food because they believe certain animals to be scared or certain plants poisonous," unquote. Ideas can shape history for good or for ill, as individuals who are heroes in Hook's sense may shape history for good or for ill. The point here is not that human beings and their beliefs are good and that all will turn out well in the end, but that human beings have the power to shape history, and this means that deterministic accounts of history are misleading at best, false and pernicious at worst. Despite Hook's criticism of determinism, he's also highly critical of Karl Popper's criticism of determinism on what Hook believed to be wrong-headed grounds. Hook, being a Marxian scholar, wasn't having any of Popper's conflations of Plato, Hegel, and Marx as a kind of totalitarian monolith. Since Popper was so passionate in his condemnation of totalitarianism in his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, many were inclined to let the slovenly scholarly standard slide because Popper was believed to be doing the Lord's work. Not Hook. Hook took Popper to task in his 1948 essay on historical understanding, which appeared shortly after The Open Society and Its Enemies. Hook's essay leads with an epigraph from a different work by Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, as follows, quote, "It is necessary to recognize as one of the principles of any unprejudiced view of politics that everything is possible in human affairs," unquote. That was Popper, as quoted by Sidney Hook. And of this epigraph that Hook used before his essay, he said, quote, "One of the marks of sanity is the realization that not everything can happen in nature. Wishes cannot be ridden like horses, and pious thoughts cannot turn away flying missiles. If it is false that everything can happen in nature, it is also false that everything can happen in human affairs, because all human affairs depend upon regularities in natural affairs. We must therefore conclude it is one of the principles of any sane view of politics to disbelieve that everything is possible in human affairs. And Popper himself, in his less splenetic moods, must agree with this, for otherwise everything he says about the desirability and practicability of piecemeal social engineering is nonsense, unquote. This is Hook again being mindful of limitations. As throughout his book on the hero in history, he is mindful not only of the possibilities that the hero represents, but also the limitations under which the hero must operate. When we think of heroes, we typically think of great men in the past. Maybe this is a function of what Huizinga called historical ideals of life. Huizinga had written, quote, "A historical life ideal may be defined as any concept of excellence man projects into the past," unquote. And his opening chapter and his opening example in this essay is Charles the Bold's desire to imitate Caesar, Hannibal, and Alexander the Great. I discussed this in my episode on historical exemplarism. But heroes aren't exclusively historical ideals. The role of the hero in history resonates with us because it appeals viscerally to human nature. And so we can expect heroes to be a part of human history for as long as human nature obtains in its present form. Hook makes his account of heroes contemporary, asking questions like whether there can be genuine heroes in a democracy and whether democracies can trust their heroes. Recently, I had a paper published in the journal Heroism Science with the title Heroic Virtues in Space Exploration, Everydayness and Supererogation on Earth and Beyond. I wanted to consider what Hook called the problem of the hero in relation to future roles, so I discussed astronauts as heroes. There's a sense that astronauts as heroes is already a part of the past if, for example, we were to consider Neil Armstrong to be a hero. But as space exploration continues, and especially if it expands, our future spacefaring history will likely prominently feature astronauts as heroes, and they will be heroes embedded within the technological civilization that makes their heroism possible. This technological civilization is still in its infancy today, but as it continues to grow, its history could be as dramatic as anything Earth has seen to date in human history, if not more so. Heroes will play a role in this future history as they have played a role in our history to date, and they too will face the kind of agonizing moral choices that Hook thought made human life tragic, but which generations of writers and poets have celebrated as among the most admirable moments in human history. In my episode on Thomas Carlyle, I quoted a line that has often been attributed to Carlyle, who is supposed to have said when looking up at the stars, "A sad spectacle. If they be inhabited, what a scope for misery and folly. If they be not inhabited, what a waste of space." As we stand on the cusp of a future history that may dwarf our history on Earth, we face the prospect that that misery and that folly that will inhabit the stars and the planets will be human misery and folly. And precisely for that reason, we will need heroes, both to overcome the misery and the folly and to compensate us when the misery and the folly is our own. One more observation on Hook's attitude to history. One essay in Hook's The Quest for Being is titled The New Failure of Nerve, which references Gilbert Murray's classic work, 5 Stages of Greek Religion, which I discussed in my episode on Gilbert Murray. Murray had diagnosed what he called a failure of nerve in late antiquity that led the people of that time to neglect public affairs in favor of private salvation. To get a sense of what Murray wanted to critique, read the famous funeral oration of Pericles in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and compare the attitudes expressed by Pericles to the attitudes expressed by the early Christian writers. You'll find that the contrast is palpable. Hook thought that he saw signs of a new failure of nerve in his time, and in his essay he concludes, quote, The new failure of nerve in contemporary culture is compounded of unwarranted hopes and unfounded beliefs. It is a desperate quest for a quick and all-inclusive faith that will save us from the trouble of thinking about difficult problems. These hopes, beliefs, and faiths pretend to a knowledge which is not knowledge and to a superior insight not responsible to the checks of intelligence. The more fervently they are held, the more complete will be their failure, unquote. In the light of what Hook wrote about the hero in history, namely that heroes play an important role in history and that they may or may not be successful in overcoming the limitations that history places upon their efforts, we can say that a failure of nerve in history, which Gilbert Murray diagnosed in late antiquity and which Sidney Hook thought threatened the 20th century, is either when no hero appears or when a hero does appear but cannot overcome the intrinsic limitations of the historical situation. And it could well be the case that no hero could overcome the limitations of a given historical civil situation. In the non-deterministic world that Hook believed us to inhabit, and I share this belief, both the hero and the triumph of the hero are possible on the one hand, but on the other hand, neither the hero nor the triumph of the hero are guaranteed. Happy birthday, Sidney Hook, and thanks for listening.